All right. So after giving a sort of outline of the direction that we're going to go in outlining this philosophy and giving a little bit of a background to what interested me in philosophy in the first place, and sort of the overarching question that I'm really after here, which, as far as I can tell, is what is a meaningfully good life? What is it, and how do we go about living it? After kind of introducing that, now in this next part, we're going to dive just like straight into that question. What my answer is to the question, what is a meaningfully good life and how do we live it? And what I have to say right off the bat here is that I think both my answer to this question and much of my philosophy in general centers around this concept of authenticity. And I know that historically, that concept of authenticity has been both used and abused in very broad sense. And it's almost why I'm hesitant to use that word. And sometimes I wonder if I should come up with a different word, because the word authenticity means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But nonetheless, I think authenticity ends up sitting really at the center of what I consider to be a meaningfully good life. And it runs through not only the discussion of ethics, but oftentimes the discussion of knowledge, the discussion of reality, the discussion of beauty, the discussion of politics, and really just what it means to be human. So that's why I want to start with that question. And I also want to start, if I can manage it here, with a simple explanation, like maybe a sentence or two of what I think a meaningfully good life looks like. And then we can get into what I mean by all these concepts. And to be perfectly frank, I'm sort of hesitant to even give this simple explanation because I'm afraid that it'll come across naive. I'm afraid that it'll be immediately misunderstood. But the whole point is to give a simple formulation. And in my experience, philosophy tends to be a lot of background work and pages and pages and pages and words and words and words to explain things that sometimes appear simple. But if I had to put it very succinctly, I would say that what it means to live a meaningfully good life is to act for the sake of what it is that you truly value. There's all sorts of implications in that. But in the same way, when I talk about being authentic, this is what I'm very nearly often referring to: the act of acting for the sake of your true values. And we'll get deeper into how I understand that entire statement, but I sort of just want to start there. And not only that, but there's an important extension of that, which is to say that a good world, a meaningfully good world, is a world in which every single person can act for the sake of what they truly value. A world in which everybody can be authentic in an unlimited and universal and interruptible process. And I also believe that when people are truly authentic, there is no fundamental conflict of value, meaning not that two people can't value different things, but that there never has to arise a situation in the world in which person A acting for the sake of what they value and person B acting for the sake of what they value really comes into fundamental conflict, meaning person A never fundamentally prevents, I'll get into what that means, but person A never really prevents person B for acting for the sake of their own values. In a world in which everybody is acting authentically, there is never really a conflict between actions. It's not like for person A to be authentic, it has to come at the cost of person B. And that would be the case, in my understanding, for the entire world. And so sometimes people, when I'm talking about authenticity, when I'm talking about the meaningfully good life, and I say a meaningfully good life is a life in which you act authentically. A meaningfully good life is a life in which you act for the sake of what you truly value. They'll say the first sort of opposition is to say, but what if my authenticity comes at the cost of somebody else's authenticity? Do I not need, or is it not moral or more ethical for me to repress or hide or cut off some kind of portion of my authenticity so that another person can also be authentic? And I'm sort of just laying it out here. We'll get into the details later at some point, but I'm sort of just laying it out here that that is not the case. That is not the case. In terms of how I understand authenticity, um, there is never a fundamental conflict in which one person must repress their authenticity for the sake of another's authenticity. A world is possible in which each and every person can be fully authentic universally without there being any conflict involved. Another way of putting this, or more abstract way of putting this, is the individual ethic, the ethic that applies to the individual, naturally, automatically, and universally maps itself onto the social reality, the social ethic. There is no real distinction between the individual ethic and the social ethic. There is no conflict of interest, you might say, between the individual and society in a world in which there is full authenticity. If every individual is being authentic, then that means that the society is fully authentic. And so long as every individual is acting for the sake of what they truly value, then the entire society is acting for the sake of what they value. There is no conflict of interest between the individual and society. And I know that these are strong claims, and we're going to get more into it. I am trying, again, I'm not so practiced at speaking about this, but I'm trying to start with the basic concepts and not spend the entire time detailing everything about those concepts, because it's going to take quite a while. And in some ways, over the course of talking about this, the concepts will reveal themselves. But going back to what I was originally saying, authenticity is the core of the entire philosophy. And what it means to live a meaningfully good life is to act for the sake of what it is that you truly value. So there's a couple things in there that we can define further. The first would be what I mean by action here. What does it mean to act for the sake of something? Because I think that it can sometimes be interpreted as simply um, action must be active, or it must be positive in some sense, that you must be doing something You sort of maybe must be in motion in some way in order for that to be action. But action can be passive in this definition. So action can include just doing nothing. It can include staring at a wall. It can include thoughts. It can include instincts. Um, it can include a variety of behavior that is not necessarily active, but at the same time, of course, the active components are a part of it too. I just don't want to get stuck on the notion that when I say to act for the sake of, that necessarily means something active, but rather just behavior in general that is associated with one's true values. The second explosive term there is value. Question of what do I mean when I'm talking about acting for the sake of a value? What what is a value? And there are some nuances to that term. And the nuances have to do with the way that we behave and act in the world at all. Now, the value, a value is something that is the aim of whatever it is that we're trying to do, right? And there might be multiple aims and multiple values involved in any given action. But, I go to work and I work a job, right? And why do I do that, right? Why do I go to a job and work there? You could say that, well, part of the value of working for a job is that I get to have money. And then the value of money is that I get to purchase the kinds of things that I need. And the value of purchasing the things that I need is that it helps me to survive. Why do I value survival? Well, I value survival because let's just say I enjoy life. And then you say, well, why do you enjoy life? And at some point you reach the end, right? This is sort of what Aristotle talked about. There is a innate end value to the kinds of things that we do, right? Whether it is a conscious value or not, whether it is a biologically situated value or not, meaning that the value, it's not sort of the person who's putting the value on it as much as it is the forces within nature that end up representing a value. So you get this with evolution in a certain way, where evolution and natural selection as a negative force produce the kinds of creatures who can survive and pass on genetics um, to the rest of the world. And while it's not an explicit, conscious, human-driven value, it is a sort of telos. It is a sort of end, whether that's arbitrary or not. What matters is that it's driven towards something, whether that be by the conditions of nature or whether that be by conscious choice, is not material to what we're talking about here. So what I just talked about would be sort of the value end. There's like three different components to a value that depend on the the stage in which you are pursuing a value. So there is the value end, the value means, and the value premise. The value premise is sort of, what do I think I want? What do I think I want? What do I think will satisfy that end condition to where I'm at a state where I am either enjoying myself, feel satisfied, or cease to act in some way because the conditions for acting have been fulfilled. It's a premise because it's not, I call it a value premise. You can call it a value experimentation, value premise, because it's not verified. You don't know whether actually pursuing the value is in the end going to be of value to you. Produce conditions that cease action and leave you satisfied, fulfilled, happy, joyful, etc. It's just a premise. You act on it, and you typically act on it out of some sort of empirical evidence from your past, or some sort of, not necessarily logical, but some sort of evidence or intuition that if you achieve the value you have in mind, whether explicitly or implicitly, that it will bring you some kind of fulfillment, some kind of pleasure, joy, satisfaction, cessation of action, relief, etc., etc. There's an innate fulfillment in the end value. And the value premise asks the question, basically makes an experimentation that says, if we pursue this value, then we will achieve this desirable end state. And then you have the value means. So let's give a concrete example here. A value premise can be something like, if I have lots of money, then I will be able to buy whatever I want, and that will leave me better off than I am right now. It'll leave me in a more desirable state than I am right now, because I'll be able to fill my needs, and I'll be able to live longer, buy whatever I want, protect myself from people who might harm me, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the value means. The value means are what it is that you do or don't do, or the situations that you put yourself in, or whatever is necessary to achieve the value premise. And the value means are also a hypothesis. You believe, while you're acting for the sake of a value, that what you're doing will actually achieve the value that you believe will bring you some sort of fulfillment or happiness. And importantly here, the value means and the value premise can be mistaken, in the sense that either the value premise doesn't actually manifest in something of value to you, it doesn't manifest in something that would bring some sort of satisfaction, contentment, improvement of circumstances, joy, etc. And the value means can be the wrong way of going about achieving the value premise. So this would be something like my job. My job is a means to get more money, right? And then you have the value end. The value end is distinct in the sense that you cannot be mistaken about the value end, at least in the moment which it is present. meaning that the value end is understood to be of true value to you, because when it is manifest, it produces that state of contentment, joy, satisfaction, cessation of action, improvement of circumstances. So this would be, I believe if I go work at this job, I'll be able to make money that will allow me to pay my bills and continue living. And that's better, in my hypothesis here, it's better than not having a job, having no money, and having to endure all the struggles that would come with not having any money and trying to survive, or not surviving at all. So I make a hypothesis, getting a job will make me happier in the end, because it will produce X and Y, because it will produce X outcome. I actually go to my job, I get the money, it enables me to purchase whatever I need to purchase in order to survive. I experience that as at least satisfactory. Doesn't necessarily have to be super joyful or wonderful or ecstatic, but it must be satisfactory, and or at least it must be satisfactory. And that is not to say in an absolute sense It's only to say that it satisfies the value premise to begin with, that there was actually a match between the value premise and um and the value end, not necessarily 100% agreement, because there's much slippage between the cup and the mouth, but enough to continue to perpetuate the action, right? So because that's the thing about values is, and that's the thing about action, is we never cease valuing, and we never cease acting. We are always acting for the sake of some kind of value. But the real value is in whatever produces the satisfaction. It's not in the premise, it's not the means. These are a hypothesis on how to get to the value, and the actual tangible action or resources or circumstances that are needed to produce the value. The value is when that when that the value is when reality manifests itself in a way that justifies the action, that makes sense of the action and the premise in a way that is satisfactory enough to keep going. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about in a very abstract way, but one of the reasons that I'm talking about it in this abstract way is because it is difficult to pin down any such thing as a universal value, meaning values are subjective, right? People want different things. And what makes one person happy or joyful or satisfied and wanting to continue acting is different between individual and individual. Not only that, but the ways in which a person goes about achieving their values is different from individual to individual, depending on their circumstances, depending on what skills they have, depending on what kind of knowledge they have, what kind of resources they have, how much time they have. The circumstances of a person's life dictate very, very much how it is they actually go about go about achieving their values. And the values themselves are, I would say, inherently subjective. There is no value which is universally found among human beings, except one, but we're going to get to that later in a separate section, because I've already gone on too much about values. But it's worth going a little bit into the technical understanding of values, because those distinctions are going to matter later on, and they kind of get obscured by the word value. But if you wanted to simplify what it means to have a value, it's like a value is whatever actually makes me happy when it's around, right? Whatever actually satisfies me when it's around, whatever brings me joy and contentment um, when it's around. It's not necessarily the thing that you pursue, because you could be mistaken in what you pursue, and you can pursue something that won't be of value to you, and you can believe that you value something that you don't. It's not like if you think it or if you believe that you value something, you value it, and it's not if you're acting for it, you value it. It's what you actually value is what brings about a value, what brings about happiness, contentment, joy, satisfaction when it's actually present in your, and what that is for a person is ultimately individual, and it is ultimately subjective. But people are doing this all the time. And much of people's lives are spent not in actually achieving what is of value to them, but in value means. That is, in satisfying the conditions necessary to produce a value. And the biggest one here is life, survival, right? Um, the thing about human beings is that we don't live for the sake of life. There are sort of some things about the pursuit of life that can have an innate value to us, right? Like the pleasure of food, or work or relationships. But living for the sake of living does not tend to be a value in human beings. Perpetuation for the sake of perpetuation does not tend to be something that human beings value. It seems that we are trying to produce the conditions for life so that we are able to live, because it's only within life itself that we can pursue the particular values that are of value to us, right? If you are starving, or you don't have access to food, or you're constantly struggling, or you're dead, you can't pursue anything that is of value to you. You need, at the very least, you need the preconditions for sustained living to be able to pursue any kind of value that you want innately, right? So this is much of where our activity goes into. It goes into satisfying the preconditions to be able to achieve values in the first place. We have to eat and sleep and work and maintain our relationships and plan and organize our resources and spend our time thinking about how it is we're going to organize ourselves, organize things around us, organize our society so that we can continue to live in, yeah, so we can continue to live. So that we'll have the time at some point to pursue our values. And much of technology is aimed at making that process, making all the time and the energy that goes into living more and more efficient, so that we have to spend less and less time worrying about the conditions for life, so that we can actually, within life, act for the sake of what we truly value. And so life in general, you could say, is a value means. It's a means to authenticity. It's a means to acting for the sake of what it is that we actually value. But nonetheless, it takes up most of our time. And the further we go back in history, the more we can see that life tended to be this just constant perpetuation of life, because technology wasn't advanced enough, the tools weren't advanced enough, the population wasn't big enough, the understanding wasn't complex enough to do much outside of just surviving. So most of our ancestors spent most of their time doing things that were related to survival and acting for the sake of what they actually valued, authenticity, was brief, or it came about in sort of uncontrolled areas, right? So much of the time they had to spend hunting, gathering, building shelter, moving places, walking places, defending themselves, all these various different kinds of things. And it was sort of the spaces in between life where they had moments of peace and moments of plenty and times of celebration and times of um, joy with one another, where they could have this kind of instinctual authenticity. And that was life, right? Life was 95% survival, 5% authenticity. And today, at least in Western countries, because of technology, you could say it's something like 70% survival, 30% authenticity. If you want to put numbers on it, right? And we're going to get into the complexities around authenticity, because that's a whole other thing. But I'm just saying that, there's this relationship between, not all human action is authentic action. Authentic action is acting for the sake of what you truly value, not acting for the sake of the conditions for authenticity, the conditions for what you value. Actually, that's not even the right phrasing, because survival can be an authentic act if it's in service of what you truly value. That's the distinction. And so the other word in there is truly. Act for the sake of what you truly value. And that's an important distinction. Acting for the sake of what you truly value matters, right? Because if you're acting for the sake of what you don't actually value, but maybe you just think you value or you think you need, then you're on the wrong track, right? If you So, we talked about the value premise and the value means, right? And how you can make mistakes in that. If you think that something is going to make you happy, or you think that a certain way of acting for what you think is happy is going to make you happy, but doesn't really make you happy, then you run into all kinds of problems, right? Now, much of that, mistakes in what you think will make you happy and mistakes in the way to get there are difficult to avoid in and of themselves, because they're based on hypothesis, right? They're based on, what has my experience been in the past when it comes to these certain kinds of values, or what do I see the people around me doing, and is it making them happy, right? And you can get a lot of information out there, especially the more that you experiment with that, um, which is ideally what like children and teenagers and young adults should be doing, is experimenting with what is it that's going to bring me happiness, what is it going to bring me fulfillment, what is it's going to bring me meaning, because there is no universal answer to that question. It is an individual answer. There are sort of trends, but there are sort of some common shared values that tend to make people happy, but there's no guarantee that it's going to make you as an individual happy. And so ideally what should happen in childhood and adolescence, and a little less, but still in early adulthood, is this experimentation. This it's you're coming up with hypothesis about what's going to make you happy based on prior experience, based on what's happening around you, and based on whatever you can sort of deduce yourself, in your own mind. And then you're going out and you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I actually go about, achieving this value? And you experiment with how to actually go about doing it. And there's so much failure that goes on there. There's so much failure that goes on there, but at the same time, you learn more and more about yourself, right? You learn more about what it is that you actually value, and then you learn more about how to actually go about achieving it. And the ideal progression is that you start, imperfectly, but you learn over time. And if you are free within that context, then that authenticity happens rapidly and naturally. It's actually an act of greater and greater authenticity over time as you learn more and more about yourself, and as you learn more and more about how to actually go about achieving what it is that you actually value. It's not inherently understood at the beginning of life, and it's not sort of just given to you in a rule book by society. It's something you have to experiment with, test, and figure out. And as you go about this process of becoming more and more authentic in a sort of natural way, we'll get to sort of what interferes with this later, but we're kind of just trying to talk about the ideal. Um, you develop the self, or it's not so much developing the self. I like to call it more, um, you come to know yourself, right? You come to reveal yourself concretely or in an embodied way. Before, when you're a child, it's all instinct. It's all, well, maybe this will make me happy, even if you're thinking about it that explicitly. And over time, as the sort of evidence compounds and you run experiment after experiment, then you learn about who you really are, what actually makes you happy, what you actually want out of life, what actually satisfies you, what actually brings you meaning, what actually makes you passionate, right? How you actually react to things. You get the truth of yourself, and not just the truth of yourself in terms of what you value, but the truth of yourself in terms of what you don't value, or how you react to things, or what capabilities you have, what skills you have, what your body is capable of, what your mind is capable of. You learn the truth of yourself. And the self is the totality of what you really are, the totality of what you really are, which is not what you think you are. It's not what you're projecting onto yourself. It's not what other people say you are. It's not what you want to be, but who you really are. And that's a composite of emotions, thoughts, values, like expectations, like how you, I don't know, how you react in relationship. You could call it personality, but it's also more than personality, an understanding of your potential, your skills, your knowledge, the collection of your experiences. It is the truth of who you are. And one way you could think about it, like it's a God's view of you, right? Because God knows you from the beginning of when you were born to now. And he sees a totality of that, all the experiences and everything that's a part of that into one composite whole. And that is your self, right? And your self is not something that you are necessarily fully conscious of at any given point. In fact, I don't think you can ever really be fully conscious of yourself. You are only aware of a very narrow range of yourself. You're only ever occupied with certain thoughts and certain values and certain memories and et cetera, et cetera. But yourself is your total composite at that moment. And there's different aspects of the self that we'll get into, right? There's like the ideal self, there is the true self, there is the false self. And, we use these terms, but none of them are at this moment, we're not going to put any value judgment on it. In fact, things like the false self are oftentimes exist in order to help us in some way that we don't necessarily recognize until later on. And all of this must be done in a kind of freedom. And what I mean by freedom is non-coercion, really freedom from force. Um, and the reason why I say freedom from force is because to be authentic, you have to be able to act for the sake of what you value. But, and so long as force is not being used against you, then you really don't have any other choice but to act for the sake of what you value, at least in terms of what you understand that to be in the moment, right? Now, I said before, you can be mistaken about what you actually value, but the individual has always a better judgment about what is actually going to be of value to them than another person. It doesn't mean that another person can't be right about what it is that we value, but it means that um, when another person uses force against you, like physical force against you in some way, they they impose their judgment on you, again, by force, not because you value it, but by force. And the definition of force is that you don't value it. If you're forced to do something, you don't value it, right? So if someone's using force against you, they are forcing you to act in a way that you don't value. They're either preventing you from doing something or making you do something, and they are replacing their judgment of what you value for your judgment about what you value. But because you have a better understanding of what you actually value, more than they would. And not only that, but by using force, they sort of cut off the authentic exploration altogether. Because now it's not about you running those experimentations that reveal to you what your authentic self is, but it is a, it is, they're cutting you off from that experience and they're replacing your judgment for their judgment without obviously your consent and therefore without you actually valuing it. So authenticity always occurs in a state of non-coercion, a state um of voluntary behavior. And you call that a precondition, precondition for authenticity, for acting for the sake of what you value. And so actually freedom and life are both preconditions of authenticity because of course you need to be alive to be able to act for the sake of what you value. But you need to be free to act for the sake of what you value, because if there is force or coercion involved, then by definition you are being forced to act in a way that is against what it is that you value. So freedom and life are preconditions for authenticity, And these are all freedom, life, and the self, or sorry, freedom, life, and authenticity are all preconditions for, and I mean this by the process of authenticity. These are all preconditions for the self, or at least understanding of the self. And we go back to the question of what does it mean to live a meaningfully good life? And there's more to say here. And I'm already at 46 minutes, so that's kind of why I'm maybe trying to wrap this up a little bit here. But going back to the question of what it means to live a meaningfully good life. And I said, what it means to live a meaningfully good life is to act for the sake of what you value, meaning to be authentic. And the reason I said this is because when we're talking about words like meaningful and good, these are value judgments, right? Good is a value judgment. Meaningful is a value judgment. And we as individuals make these value, and only as individuals, make these value judgments all the time. We say this is good and this is bad. This is meaningful and this is meaningless. This is purposeful and this is purposeless, right? And those value judgments always come from within the individual. They always come from within our understanding of the world in terms of how we've experienced it and in terms of how, you can call it genetics, you call it soul, whatever you want, but how our individuality has reacted in relationship to the world around us, right? And I know there are other criticisms of this, right? And later on we get into like structuralism and post-structuralism and the critique against the self, because there are those who say that the self is really nothing more than like an intersection of all of these different kinds of um, social structures and history and et cetera, et cetera. But we'll get into that later. But sort of just trying to lay out the framework here. And also I really just appreciate you kind of sticking with me if you gotten to this point, because again, this is sort of my first time in really trying to lay this out, at least verbally. And honestly, I'm sort of struggling, but I hope it comes across clear, at least to get a certain idea of what I'm talking about. Because after all, the goal is not to be perfect. But when we say a meaningfully good life, because the valuation is subjective, because what it means to be good is subjective, and what it means to be meaningful is subjective, the only thing that we can say categorically to answer this question is that people acting for the sake of what it is that they value is the standard for how we know things are good or how we know things are meaningful, because meaning and goodness is being acted out universally, either within an individual's life or within society to the greatest extent that is possible for a human being who doesn't have complete access to themselves, right? Meaning something like a person who's always acting for the sake of what they value. Do they always achieve what they value? No, but that is not the standard of meaning or good. The standard of meaning or good is, am I acting? Am I continuously acting for the sake of what I value, such that I come to understand myself and get a better and better understanding of who I am, so that I can act better and better in order to achieve what it is that I value throughout my life, right? Am I doing that, or is something arresting that process, right? The self is the center of meaning. The self is the center of goodness and is the standard for that goodness insofar as one is acting for the sake of who they are, what they truly value. And this must be done, as I said before, in a environment of freedom. So what is the ideal life? The ideal life is, from the beginning, an individual acting for the sake of what they value in total freedom. And picture of the ideal life is an individual acting for the sake of what they value to the greatest extent of freedom as possible. This being an individually derived standard that must be situated in freedom. And this would socially translate into a world in which every single individual could act for the sake of what they value in a universal condition of freedom, meaning free to act for the sake of what they value, or without force being used against them. So in the absence of force, that would be the standard. um, there is another way I could try to explain this real quick, or at least I can attempt to. I can attempt to, because this is the I'm giving you a formulation that's kind of just off the top of my head as I'm going, right? And again, I hope it comes across clear. But there's also another formulation that I've tried here, where talking about a universal value, which is to say, um, we started off by saying there is no such thing as universal values, and I said, but there is, except one, right? There is one universal value, and not only is it a universal value, but is actually the universally highest value that human beings have. And this is a classic philosophical tactic for situating ethics, right? If you can find a value, which is not only universal, but the universally highest value, then you can use that as a standard for morality, right? And I don't even know if this is the best way to formulate it, but this is the way I formulated it before, which is to say that the one value that we can say is universal is that everybody values acting for the sake of what they value. And the reason we know why everybody values it, that the ability to act for the sake of what they value, is because this is what everybody is doing all the time. You actually can't help but act for the sake of what you value, you know, because in the moment of acting, you think that whatever it is that you're acting for, you value. So you're always acting for the sake of what you think you value. And everybody wants this capacity. And we know this because the only thing that arrests this capacity is force. If somebody uses force against you, then you are unable to act for the sake of what you value, because you're being prevented by somebody else, and now you must act against what you value in some capacity, either being prevented from acting or having to act in a different way, right? And so if you use the value of being able to act for the sake of what you value as our universally highest standard, and highest because it's the necessary precondition for anything else that we value, we must be able to act for the sake of what we value if we're going to actually achieve any kind of value, of genuine value to us. So it is the highest value because it is a precondition for any value itself, even life, even value means. It is a precondition for value itself, which is what we all really value, like in a sort of tautological way, but it's at the same time it's true. Acting for the sake of what we value is a necessary universal precondition for meaning and goodness, because meaning and goodness are individually value driven. They're definitions which come from the individual, but then we can look at the structural way in which people actually behave and notice the universal precondition. And so we say we protect the universal precondition because it's necessary for any kind of value, any kind of goodness, the even the act of force. The person who uses force wants to be able to be free to use force, right? The person who wants to be violent wants to be free to be violent. So a that standard applied universally would result in a world which was absent from force. So that's another way of formulating it. I don't know if that's any more clear, but that way of formulating it is also, I don't think, is as positive. It's not necessarily formulating it in the positive way. In the positive way is just to say that to act for the sake of what you value, what you truly value, that is what it means to live a meaningfully good life, because the individual defines what is meaningful and the individual defines what is good. And living means actually embodying or manifesting what is meaningful and what is good. Now, we don't know that a priori. It comes through experience and it comes through reflection. So if you want to live a meaningfully good life, you have to be able to act for the sake of what you truly value. And the question comes up that naturally might come up with this is, well, don't we do that anyways? Isn't this sort of automatic? Don't we always act for the sake of what we truly value? And the short answer to that is no. There are many things that get in the way of this. And it actually turns out that the vast majority of our life is not acting for the sake of what we truly value. And that's sort of what we're going to get into next time when when we talk about sort of, okay, what gets in the way? What's the obstacles? What really prevents this? And I think talking about the obstacles too is going to help me to flesh out more of what I mean when saying acting for the sake of values. Because I think the difficulty I sometimes have, at least with talking about these concepts, is how do I talk about it without talking about everything, right? How do I talk about authenticity without mentioning all the things that get in the way of authenticity? And in some ways, these concepts like the self and freedom and life and authenticity, they are better revealed by the things that get in the way of them than they are revealed positively. Because positively, even though they are the very meaning and center of life, talking about them, you necessarily have to talk about them in an abstract way because they are so subjective. They depend from individual to individual. Acting for the sake of what you value is an incredibly subjective. It's incredibly subjective understanding, and no matter what examples I give, that's going to be inauthentic for somebody else. And I'm trying to formulate it in this universal way. So again, hey, if you made it this far, I appreciate you just sticking with me as I ramble through this, and I hope that this was at all clear to you because this is what I would say. This is one of my I've done it a couple times, but this is one of my first times really just trying to flesh out uh verbally the what I'm talking about here, and naturally it's kind of stumbling. It's a little confused. I think it's been a bit choppy, but maybe I'm also just being too critical of myself. But I appreciate you if you stuck this far. And next time we're going to talk about the kind of things that get in the way of a meaningfully good life. What gets in the way of acting for the sake of what we value? What gets in the way of knowing who we truly are and acting for it? So we'll talk about that next time.